Bull did Ricciardo dirty. It's official, Ricciardo is being dropped for the remainder of the 2024 season, and Liam Lawson is going to step in for the rest of the season for the second seat at VCARB. Let's talk about that. Hello everybody, my name is Michael, and welcome back to Last to First. The news that we have all been waiting for is officially here. It is a sad thing to hear. Nobody wants to hear that Ricciardo is going to be out of his seat for the remainder of the season. It was very likely that he wasn't going to be re-signed for next year, but for him to be dropped near the end of the season with just a few races to go, it is quite unfortunate, especially for a driver that has as much respect and liking amongst the fan base as somebody like Ricciardo. We were expecting some news on this for quite some time, particularly after the Singapore Grand Prix. There was rumor mill after rumor mill that he could be getting dropped, and here we are. He is officially dropped, and what an unfortunate send-off for Ricciardo. Red Bull really did not handle this well, in my opinion, and I think generally the F1 community is not at all pleased with how they handled this. They really should have given Ricciardo a proper send-off at Singapore. It seems as though Ricciardo did know it beforehand, and the decision was already made before Singapore, so they really should have just done a proper send-off and not had this weird up-in-the-air thing where nobody really knew what was happening. It really made them look stupid, and it really was a sad send-off for Ricciardo for it to be his final race, and what is likely going to be his final F1 race ever. He's talked about not wanting to fiddle around in the midfield or at the back of the grid, and if he doesn't have an opportunity to get into a top team, which he tried to but unfortunately wasn't able to with Red Bull, then he's not going to mess around with other teams. Plus, other teams just aren't showing any interest in him, unfortunately. I think, as sad as it is, he's just past his prime, and I guess time catches up with everybody eventually, and his time was now. So unfortunately, it does look like that was the last ever Formula One race for Ricciardo, but I'm sure we'll still see him around the paddock. Who knows, he might be in some type of role at a team like Red Bull for marketing purposes, just to continue to be around. He is one of the most favorite drivers on the grid, one of the most popular drivers on the grid, so I'm sure we'll definitely see him around. If you are a Buffalo Bills fan with American football, he's a big fan of that team as well, so I'm sure we'll see him at some games there as well. But I'm sure it won't be the last of Ricciardo that we see. So why are Red Bull deciding to drop him for the rest of the season? Whether they want to admit it or not, I think the only logical reason why they would drop him for the remainder of the season is for them to test out Liam Lawson to see if he could be a potential Perez replacement. I think they've wanted to replace Perez for a little while now. He hasn't shown the best of form, particularly as of late, but there just hasn't been a very strong candidate to replace him. And I just can't imagine any other reason that they would already need to drop Ricciardo prematurely just to get Lawson in the car. They've seen Lawson last year when he filled in Ricciardo. They know what he's capable of so far, at least in the VCARB team. So why else would they want to put him in so early? They must be wanting to see if he can really shine and show something that will make them want to drop Perez in favor of Liam Lawson. One could argue that they wanted to just put Liam Lawson in the car because they already knew that he was going to be in the car for next year, so might as well let him get some races under his belt this year and be fully prepared for next year. But he's already had a few F1 races under his belt when he stood in for Ricciardo, so why is that really necessary going into next year with the full season, other than to evaluate him to see if he might be able to replace Perez? Now, what does all this mean for Sergio Perez? I've kind of alluded to some possibilities already, but is it really all that doom and gloom for him? I think it's very, very possible that it is not a good sign for Perez. If I was Perez, I would certainly be getting more and more uncomfortable in my seat if I were him. He really needs to put on some good performances and show Red Bull why they need to keep him, or just hope that Liam Lawson doesn't do a stellar job for them to be able to justify swapping them. But it is very concerning for Perez. I think his seat has been under threat for a very long time. They just haven't had an opportunity or a better driver to be able to replace him with, except for Carlos Sainz, who they just are constantly or were constantly overshadowing, unfortunately, and maybe even Yuki Tsunoda, but they want nothing to do with Yuki Tsunoda. But nonetheless, there's going to be more and more pressure on Perez to perform for the rest of this year, especially if Liam Lawson starts to have some good races to end the year. I know Sergio Perez was quote unquote confirmed for a couple more years with his Red Bull contract, and we don't know all those specific details. What are some of the clauses? What are some of the ways in which Red Bull could trade him out? But he'll know, and he'll certainly be shaking in his boots a little bit because he'll know which ways they can take him out of his contract. So I'm sure there's some type of clause in there where Red Bull would be able to swap, either swap him and Liam Lawson or just completely drop Perez altogether. I would imagine if they do decide to throw Liam Lawson into the car, into the Red Bull next year in replace of Sergio Perez, then Perez will be out, and probably Isaac Hadjar will be in the V carb next year. But who knows? Crazier things have happened in the Red Bull driver market. I also wanted to touch on the fact that Christian Horner was mentioning George Russell being out of contract at the end of 2025, which was definitely very interesting. I think it really shows that Red Bull is starting to look outside of its pool of drivers, even more so than it did with Perez, and really look for a different alternative to have alongside Max Verstappen, as well as considering what life would be without Max Verstappen. He's always talked about potentially being done at the end of his current Red Bull contract, maybe even sooner. And then also with all of the recent stuff going on with the FIA quote unquote clampdown on swearing and all of the beef going on between Verstappen and the FIA, he really doesn't seem interested in a lot of these shenanigans. So who knows how early he will call it quits. So they definitely want to be prepared with some secondary options if Verstappen is to retire at some point in the near future. Ultimately, it's just smart moves from Red Bull to be considering other drivers for the future. I mean, George Russell would be on any major team's radar, on any team's radar in Formula One, even though he does have some asterisks next to him. Sometimes a little mistake prone. Is the pressure a little too much for him sometimes? He's still an incredibly quick driver and could easily slot in as a lead driver at any team. So it'd be foolish to not go after him. I did think it was funny to see Christian Horner going back at Toto Wolff by going after one of his drivers, since Toto Wolff has been clamoring for Max Verstappen for so long, just yapping at the bits, trying to get Verstappen to come over to Mercedes. It was a little funny to see Christian Horner go back at him for that. And then it was even more super ironic that Toto Wolff was all salty about Christian Horner trying to poach George Russell, saying he's just trying to stir the pot and stir stuff up. And it's literally what Toto Wolff has been doing for months and months now, trying to poach Verstappen. So their relationship and their drama between the two of them and the drama between their two teams just continues to make a lot of funny things happen in the world of Formula One, and I'm here for it. I'm here for that drama. I love to see them go back and forth. It makes for some interesting content, that's for sure. But I think there is a serious world, a potential real world scenario where there is a Russell and Verstappen swap within a few years. It's very possible that Verstappen might want out of Red Bull with all the stuff going on there, with all their recent question marks with performance, with Christian Horner, everything that's gone on this year. It is very possible that he might want out of there. And it's very clear that Mercedes wants him, despite them having already two potentially great drivers. And it looks like probably George Russell would be the one to get dropped in place of Verstappen, because Kimi Antonelli is apparently the next big thing and is, the star of the future. So it's unlikely that they would get rid of Kimi Antonelli unless he really, really shows that he's nowhere near the level of Formula One, which I can't imagine that would be the case. So I think it's a very real possibility that there is a Russell and Verstappen swap in the future. So who knows what will happen. crazier things have happened, and only time will tell with that whole scenario. So I just wanted to give some of my quick thoughts on the Ricciardo news, as well as the drama going on with George Russell and Christian Horner. And we knew it was coming for a little while, but it is really sad to see it here. The F1 paddock, the F1 community, everything's going to be a lot different without Daniel Ricciardo around. It is really unfortunate to see. On some respects, I do see where they're coming from with it. It does make sense for them to want to test out Lawson to replace Perez for the next year, and it does make sense for them to replace Ricciardo at the minimum for next year, because while Ricciardo has been doing okay, he hasn't been doing exactly great, but it was just really, really poorly done on Red Bull's part. I don't know what they were thinking. I feel like it was just an absolute PR disaster, and just morally really did Daniel Ricciardo wrong. And it's just unfortunate. With as much as he's given to that team, as much as he's given to the sport, I think you do got to show him a little more respect, just on a personal level, for him to at least give him that proper send-off. I get it. Formula One's all about performance, so that's okay. If they got to drop him, they got to drop him. But how they did it was not the right way to go. Unfortunate stuff. But that's the way of Formula One. It's ruthless. Particularly the Red Bull driver conundrum is particularly ruthless. And here we are with another storied scene in the Red Bull driver pool. All right, so thank you all for tuning in to this quick podcast to round up some Ricciardo news. I appreciate you all tuning in during this extended, unfortunate, long break that we have in the fall here in the season before we end things off. Give me a follow on social media if you're interested. I'm on Twitter as Last to First Real, first spelled F1RST. I'm on Instagram as Last to First. Follow me on all the major podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, Google, also on YouTube as Last to First. Also, I have a blog at lasttofirst.wordpress.com. Once again, first spelled F1RST. So let me know what your thoughts are in the comments below on the Ricciardo news that has all come about. And thank you all for tuning in. Stay tuned for more content in the world of Formula One.